We're now ready to move on to our closing speaker for the afternoon. Certainly last but not least, bringing home full circle. The motivation for this project, remember, comes from nature conservation. It's very important to keep in mind the Tiffany and Company Foundation, they were interested in the pearls, not because they are used in jewelry. They were interested because the mandate, one of the mandates of the foundation is coral conservation and oceanic conservation. So the role of international environmental NGOs is going to be critically important in moving this idea forward. And we have with us representing the Nature Conservancy, Louisa Ho, who is the director of the Hong Kong office, and she's leading one of the world's largest environmental NGOs. The conversation with TNC, we hope, is going to continue. I had the pleasure of meeting the CEO of the Nature Conservancy in 2012, Mark Tersak, at Davos, and we were just starting this project then at the time. And it's wonderful to see that conversation come to this point that we can have Louisa engaged as well moving forward. So thank you, Louisa.
So good afternoon, Louisa from the Nature Conservancy. So in my role, I'm tasked with two major objectives. One is about the work in conservation, and it's not just within the borders of Hong Kong, but also outside. Nature cannot be confined, so when we talk about conservation, it's really about whole systems. Second is talking about conservation itself in a way that makes sense to people. I can guarantee you that when we step out of this room and I start talking about methodologies and ERAs to passerby and Wan Chai, people won't even know what I'm talking about before I get into the whole reason why conservation is important. I'm glad today that we're talking about the same language, and the things that's happening on the production side, on the pearl farming, is very encouraging to see. Okay, so conservation is about protecting nature, but the question is why? And quite simply, people need nature. So the food we eat, the water we drink, and the pearls we farm, these are things that ultimately we need a really good infrastructure for nature, and it's in our best interest to protect it. But do we? Yes, people need nature, but the other side of the equation is nature needs people. In my presentation, I wanted to focus on innovative approaches to marine conservation. Innovation is not about the technology of it, but rather I want to focus on how to achieve the desired conservation outcome by thinking with a fresh approach. Okay. So first off, I wanted to say a few words about the Nature Conservancy to put in context some of the examples that I'll give. Nature Conservancy works in over 35 countries, including 8 operating units in Asia Pacific. TNC has over 60 years of experience with annual budgets of $400 million in conservation projects around the world. We are a science-based organization with over 600 scientist staff. Our approach is non-confrontational, which means that we work with different partners on different levels of society, including organizations, governments, corporations, and local communities. TNC works on a practical solution that addresses environmental issues at its source. So to some, conservation is about protecting the last great places. But if you're not a diver or a marine biologist, the pristine places may not mean as much to you. But what if we frame it a little bit different? Marine conservation is about ensuring that our oceans keep providing for people. The map shows population impact. Between now and 2050, Asia's urban population will nearly double from 1.6 billion to 3.1 billion. Globally, the world will reach 9 billion by 2050, and most of the people will be living in cities. This means two things. One, development of cities often means a greater impact on coastlines and marine habitat. Secondly, the larger population also commands a greater demand on commodities and resources coming from the ocean. So the Nature Conservancy looks at ocean management holistically. We work in places, but we also lend expertise globally. The 3 examples that I'll give today are coral reefs and fisheries, both from the Coral Triangle region, and oyster reefs from North America. First one, coral reefs. People think coral reefs are very picturesque and great opportunities for divers. But I've been to the lab, and I can tell you that coral reefs are indeed very spectacular. But more than that, reefs serve as nurseries and feeding grounds for the huge diversity of marine life. In Asia Pacific, there is the Coral Triangle region, and although it contains only 2% of the world's oceans, it's home to 76% of the world's coral species, and 40% of the world's live reef fish species. The coral reefs provide sustenance and livelihood to about 126 million people in the region and feed a million more worldwide. In Hong Kong, for example, over 60% of our seafood comes from the Coral Triangle region. So, to maintain a healthy core means maintaining healthy coral reefs. But the coral reefs are in peril. So presently, more than 75% of the world's coral reefs are seriously threatened due to pollution, coastal development, destructive fishing, and climate change. An example of climate change occurred in 1998 when the rise in global sea temperature triggered a massive bleaching event. By its end, 16% of the world's reef had died. So how did this happen? So how many of you have seen the movie Finding Nemo? There's a picture there that Nemo is poking his head up from the anemone, and there's a lot of waving corals around it. But these tentacles are in fact coral branches that has tiny algae living on them. And that's what gives it its brilliant colors. Bleaching occurs when the corals get stressed. With the increased temperature due to climate change, the tiny algae is ejected from the coral, and the coral turns white, and thus the term bleaching. If algae is not reabsorbed back into the coral will die. The good news is that corals were able to recover. Science helped. Conservation scientists continued their research. They looked at resilience and adaptation of specific corals and the effect of sea level rise and acidification of the ocean habitat. TNC and our partners had also set out to identify, to protect and manage most protective and resilient coral reefs and secure them in protected areas. These protected areas are strategically selected and connected by ocean currents so that coral larvae from the healthy corals can replenish themselves as well as other areas continually. This describes the science and conservation side of things. However, to a scale, we need to think innovatively to influence the right people. Governments are definitely the right people. They are key stakeholders to provide legislative framework, enforcement power, and ongoing support. However, governments are a diverse group of people with competing interests and conflicting backgrounds. To talk about conservation was a long, arduous task. However, it's not impossible. A success story was the Coral Triangle Initiative. This is a region that spans 6 countries, from Indonesia, Malaysia, East Timor, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. Its significance is that the region contains nearly 73,000 square kilometers of coral reef. That's 29% of the global total. In 2007, TNC had led the efforts that eventually resulted in the President of Indonesia presenting the idea of a pan-regional initiative to protect coral reef called CTI. This was signed by 6 countries in 2009, and most recently last month, it was ratified. This now means that the CTI is an independent and legal intergovernmental body empowered to address environmental issues, and protection is one of its objectives. Conservation is an inherent goal for all of us here, but for governments, that's not the case. The original impetus for the government was not altruism. It was to address how to leverage the environment to generate significant income, livelihood, and food security for coastal communities. To do that, healthy marine conservation and practices, including marine protected areas, sustainable fishery practices, and coral reef protection, needed to be at the forefront. Our second case study is about food. As a Hong Konger, I'm a big foodie. When I first joined TNC and had the chance to go diving in Palau, I was surrounded by myriads of different marine life. And all I could think of was how many of these species appear on a Chinese menu. So it's not surprising then that Hong Kong consumes over 4 times more seafood than the global average. The increase in demand for worldwide for seafood adds pressure to fishing communities. And in developing nations of the Pacific, the problems are more evident as fishing is often unrestricted and poorly controlled. Regulations are insufficient and unenforced, and some government policies even promote economic prosperity by leveraging quantity. This has an adverse effect on fish, as fish do not have time to recuperate. According to a UN report, more than 75% of commercially significant fisheries have been depleted or overfished. On the ground, as fish stock dwindles, fishermen react with desperate measures. They may use destructive fishing to target hard-to-reach fish, or they may meet fish for smaller fish size that may have not reached maturity age or the breeding stage. Middlemen take advantage of this and impress with lower costs for the fish based on worsening conditions, which goes to perpetuate the cycle even more. So among the challenges facing the fishing community, I'll just name two. First, there lacks data. Fishermen in developing countries often rely on sustainable fisheries with little scientific inputs. They have a field of land, but they don't have the tangible data to base their judgment or to have data to have solid negotiation with the middleman. Traditional stock assessment models require vast amounts of biological and historical data, and they demand a lot of technical expertise and expensive and are time intensive. Secondly, there lacks regulation. So there's an estimated 10,000 fishing organizations in the world, but only 350 of those have been formally assessed. So an innovative approach is to work with partners. TNC formed a partnership with the University of California, Santa Barbara, called Pacific Fish, PACFISH. The aim was to focus on improving fishery management in the Pacific region. In Indonesia, PACFISH was partnering with International Seafood Community, PT Valley Seafood International, and other key organizations to form the Lesa Sundar Sustainable Fisheries Initiative. This initiative builds an integrated model that links growing international demand for sustainable seafood with a market-ready sustainable supply chain in Indonesia. The initiative also works with the Lesa Sundar government to reform open access fisheries so that we can change it to rights-based fisheries. So if you take it in the context of land, if you know where your front yard is, you can protect it. So this creates better engagement and accountability for local communities and empowers them to manage their area better. The plan also sets up fish processing mini plants that's closer to these sites, so the fishermen have access to responsible plants that can benefit from competitive pricing. So the last example I'd like to give is about oyster reef conservation in the US. So oyster reef provides structure against erosion and climate change. Oyster reefs help diffuse the energy of waves so that the water laps at the shoreline instead of crashing into it. This reduces erosion. Oysters are also natural filters for water and can suck up to 20 gallons of water through its innards every day. This filters out the plankton and other nuisances and improves water quality. The combination makes it easier for seagrass to grow, and which in turn provides nurseries for other sea creatures. Natural oyster habitats have been severely degraded. This is a legacy of oyster overharvest and outright destruction. There is degradation of nearshore reefs by climate change, water pollution, fishing gear damage, and recreational overuse. In the temperate coastlines of the U.S., the extent of loss ranges from 50 to 99%. In this example, innovation is about thinking beyond borders of 4 coastline states. Conservation work that was done in Northern Carolina, Southern Carolina, Georgia, and North Florida contributed to mapping a whole system that helped shape and inform the implementation of the larger restoration projects. Analysis of the federal and state-specific policies that affect the oyster reef restoration was done not just for one state, but for all 4. Capacity learned, and the development of a habitat sustainable index were shared. So 2 other locations for oyster reef restoration in the U.S. gives us a different perspective on innovation. In Maryland and Virginia, the aim was to construct up to 75 acres of native oyster reefs. The Chesapeake Peak watershed is an important habitat that generates nearly 500 pounds of seafood each year, which is worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Scale is important, so the aim was to restore at least 300 acres of these oyster reefs within 10 years. This would be a costly endeavor, but the project was pitched in a way that it could use private and state funding to leverage a much larger federal investment in oyster reef restoration. In places like Alabama, an innovative approach to restoration was experimenting with man-made oyster reefs. The project used 3 different methods to build the reef, which combined natural and man-made materials. The aim was to see which of these methods was more conducive to germinate, cement, and grow. The ultimate goal is that science can facilitate the conditions that nature would need to be able to generate naturally in the long term. So, innovation is not necessarily about new technology, but it's about new approaches to make things happen. Whether it's engaging in governments with new incentives and platforms like the Coal Triangle Initiative to amplify change, or whether it's working with partners such as Pacific Fish Initiative to make innovative conditions for local communities to be more effective. That's innovation. Innovation is also about approach and breaking down traditional silos to affect change. Conservation is a long and often challenging journey, and with many months ahead, so to innovate is to adapt and overcome. I want to thank you for the opportunity to tell the story of nature. Nature is inherently a part of our lives and is closer to anything. Thank you.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions and for wrap up. One immediate question I have with regard to the Nature Conservancy is recently there was a restructuring where your scientists were agglomerated with a nature server, another organizational entity. Would you tell us more about the rationale there? Because here too we've been working between the scientists and the business practitioners and the policymakers and the advocates. How has that been progressing?
So science remains a key part of the Nature Conservancy and the things that we do. But in addition, we are also recognize that we can't do everything. So one of the ways to amplify and to have change is to partner with people. Something that you may be referring to is the Natural Capital, so NatCap, Natural Capital, which is a partnership between TNC, WWF, University of Stanford, and University of Minnesota. And that is an autonomous entity that takes a look at some of the tools that goes into measuring, as well as some of the things that are happening on the ground. So that is a separate entity, but the scientists in our TNC, within TNC, is actually still very strong, still very much part of us.
Other questions or comments?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Louisa. So, in terms of now just wrapping up, the sun is shining now brightly on us, but I will take that as a good omen. You've all been very patient with the slight delay also we've had in our schedule. I've found the conversations to be very fruitful. It's a small but very engaged group, and as noted, we're going to use this just as a starting point for many more conversations and efforts to come. So all of the material will be made available online probably within 2 to 4 weeks. We will also have additional material sent by email and so on. We won't spam you, don't worry, but we'll send occasionally as needed material that we think might be of interest to you. And we hope to continue this tradition of having a Sustainable Pearls Forum once a year, and perhaps do it in different locations and venues based on particular opportunities which may arise. So one idea possibly might be to do it in Washington next year with the Explorers Forum at the National Geographic Society. I've already started conversations with them about that. But I would welcome ideas for other venues and opportunities which may arise as well. For example, there is in September the Small Island States Forum in Samoa, where some of you may be present. It's the United Nations Forum, held only once every 3 years. Clearly that's going to be an interesting opportunity as well. We have climate change forums which are arising. We've got the COP meeting in Paris which is going to be very significant coming up next year. It's going to be one of those milestone meetings again. And again, this kind of conservation effort is going to play a very important role in some of the side activities at these forums. So, but we don't want it just to be about forums. We want it to be, we don't want to be a think tank, we want to be a think and do tank. And that's been the way this project has been progressing throughout. And that's the way we hope it will continue. We can monitor and evaluate and improve the performance, thereby making pearls more attractive, making pearls also much more profitable as well. So both attractive and profitable, the business case and the ethical case in their own right. So again, thanks to all of you. Special thanks to Laurent and Julie. Of course, they've really been the shepherds of this process, much more so than me. But I've been honored to work with them, to work with many of you, and I hope this will just be the beginning. So thank you and have a good evening. All the best.